Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. This month marks the 48th anniversary of the Israeli attack on the U.S. Navy spy ship, the USS Liberty. The attack took place during the Arab-Israeli War of 1967. The official story of the attack was that it was a case of mistaken identity. What we know is that the spy ship was attacked by 4 Israeli fighter bombers, Navy motor torpedo boats, near Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. It's officially said the attack was an error, that the U.S. ship in question was thought to be an Egyptian ship. But many, including former heads of the CIA and NSA, never believed the Israeli version of the events. Surviving witnesses of the attack confirm that this could not have been a mistake. They say that day in June 1967 was clear that the American flag was very visible on the ship. But as we know from a report that Pulitzer Prize winner John Crutzen wrote in the Baltimore Sun and the Chicago Tribune in 2007, there weren't meant to be any survivors. Crutzen quotes Steve Forsland, who worked as an intelligence analyst for the Air Force. The ground control station, meaning Israeli, ordered the aircraft to attack and sink the target and ensure they left no survivors. Today we'll speak to one of those survivors. Sergeant Bryce Lockwood joins us from Stratford, Missouri. He served 13 years in the Marine Corps as a staff sergeant and remains the only surviving Marine of the attack on the Liberty. As a Marine, he received the Silver Star for heroism. Also joining us from Arlington, Virginia is Ray McGovern. Ray is a former CIA analyst who was employed under 7 U.S. presidents for 27 years. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Bryce, I want to kind of jump to the end, and then we'll work our way chronologically. If this communication that Crutzen quotes, that the mission was actually to sink the boat, and so that I want to assume so there wouldn't be any witnesses to the attack, why didn't they sink it?
Well, I think they ran out of ammunition. I know the aircraft ran out of ammunition. And the motor torpedo boats, there were 3 of them. The standard formation is a wedge formation, 1 in the center and 2 held back a little bit. The forward one fires 2 torpedoes and swings off. The next one fires 2 torpedoes and swings off. And the third one likewise. So there should have been 6 torpedoes fired. There were 5 that were fired. Only 1 actually struck the ship. But it struck the ship in the vital area where all of our communications personnel, intelligence personnel were working. As a matter of fact, I have a picture right here. This was taken of me the next morning.
So, still, you would think, would the planes not be able to keep bombing and sink the ship?
There were only so many rockets and so many 40 millimeter cannon shells that they could fire at us. There were over 820 large caliber strikes on the ship, including napalm. There were 2 napalm bombs dropped onto us, rockets, and 40 millimeter cannon fire, which makes a pretty big hole. The ship, when those rockets struck it, it was literally like a very hot knife through butter. Just melted 3/4 inch steel on the skin of the ship.
Now, if I understand correctly, from what I know of the story, there was some kind of blocking of SOS messages, but finally an SOS message does get through, or there's evidence that one did get through earlier and wasn't responded to, and we're going to get to that part of the story. But then an SOS message does go through, and then the Israelis break off their attack. Is that correct?
The Israelis were jamming our distress frequencies. That's a violation of international law. It's okay to jam tactical frequencies, normally where orders are sent back and forth between ships and personnel and aircraft and so forth. That is okay to do that, but not international distress frequencies. That's a violation of international law. And the Israelis were jamming our distress frequencies. They had shot up all of our transmitting antennas in the first air raids. And we had 1 whip antenna, which was not working. A young sailor by the name of Terry Halbardier took a roll of coaxial cable and ran that back to the after part of the ship to that 1 whip antenna. And the radio operators had figured out that when rockets were being fired from the aircraft, that they couldn't jam their distress frequencies because the jamming was also screwing up the flights of the rockets. So there was a brief period of a few seconds time when rockets were being fired at us when the jamming was not taking place.
Right.
And that's when the distress frequency was sent off.
Before we go any further, how many people were killed and wounded that day?
There were 34 killed. 9 were killed topside in the aircraft attacks, and 25 were killed in the research compartment by the torpedo explosion. We had a total complement of 294 personnel altogether. That included 3 civilian analysts from the linguists from the National Security Agency, us 3 Marines, and the balance were naval personnel, both intelligence personnel and those who operated the ship. There were 208 total Purple Hearts awarded out of a crew of 294.
So just to frame this discussion a little bit, the evidence seems to point to, although the official version concluded otherwise, that the Israelis knew exactly what they were doing, we're going to get into the detail of this with Bryce and Ray, that the ship was clearly visible, and that 34 people are killed and many more wounded, and yet this goes down in history as an error with which some compensation was paid for the error. But then let's deal with sort of the big question, Bryce. Based on you being there that day and what you saw, why do you think this couldn't have been a mistake?
We were overflown several times during the morning of June the 8th by Israeli aircraft, at least 8 times, 8 different occasions that we were overflown. And the reason they were doing that is to make sure that they knew exactly where all of our transmitting antennas were, so when they attacked, they could knock us out. Now, the excuses the Israelis give, well, they didn't see a flag. Excuse me, they shot down 2 flags, and we ran up 3. The 3rd flag that we ran up was our holiday flag. That's the largest flag you have aboard ship. They claim, well, we couldn't see a flag because of smoke. Well, there wasn't any smoke until the Israelis dropped napalm on us. They claimed that they thought that we were an Egyptian ship, the El Qasir, which is a World War I horse carrier, had not been to sea for 20 years and was waiting to be cut up for scrap. Well, there's some problems with that excuse also. Number one, U.S. ships are painted gray with white markings. Our hallmark was GTR5. That's your ship's license plate. GTR5 stands for General Technical Research, the 5th ship of her class, the largest and newest ship of her class. General Technical Research means she's a non-combatant, and non-combatants are not legitimate military targets. I mentioned U.S. ships are painted gray with white markings. Egyptian ships are painted black with gray markings, and those hallmarks are in Arabic script. Big difference. And nobody from Israel can give me the excuse that they don't know the difference between English markings and Arabic script. All highway signs in Israel are marked in Arabic.
Is it possible that this is in the midst of a war? There's who knows how many pieces of information and data the command has to process at the same time. If you look at Crewdson's article, I should have said that he wrote that for the Chicago Tribune and the Baltimore Sun in 2007. At the very end of the article, there's a timeline, and in that timeline, I'll read what he has here. He says, the Israeli naval commander orders the commander of the torpedo boat division to attack the Liberty. This is 2:20 p.m. At almost the same time, the Naval Operations Branch orders, do not attack. It's possible the aircraft not identified correctly. The commander of the torpedo boat division says he never got any order to cease the attack, although the deputy commander says he passed the message to the commander. Once they really launched the attack and continued the attack, actually that's my question, how long did this attack go on for?
The attack lasted a total of 75 minutes when we were actively being shot at.
So it's not possible over the course of that early into that 75 minutes, they know what they're attacking, and maybe they know what they're attacking right from the beginning, that if this information that Crewdson gives in the timeline is correct, there's contradictory orders coming from the Israeli command. I mean, I guess this is a bit of theorizing, but is it possible this begins as a miscommunication error, and then once they start the attack, then they decide to sink the ship because it's better that there's no witnesses to it than not?
If you go on YouTube and search the day Israel attacked America, there's an hour-and-a-half long film on there, and the actual conversations in Hebrew between ground control and the aircraft are on that film, the day Israel attacked America, in Hebrew, identifying it as an American ship.
So there's no question in your mind from the very beginning they have to know it's an American ship, and based on the quote I read from in the introduction, actually let me read a little more of that quote because it's when you hear the whole quote, it's rather damning. So this is.
Let me just interject this, Paul. Yeah. Had the Israelis been shooting at the El Qasir, which they claim, the torpedoes would have totally missed. Torpedoes have to be set for a certain depth in order to strike their target in a vital place. USS Liberty was 3 times the tonnage of El Qasir and much larger depth. Had the Israelis been shooting at El Qasir, the torpedoes that they fired would have totally missed because of the difference in draft.
Well, does that explain why so many did miss?
Quite frankly, I think the Israeli Navy was not nearly as competent as the Israeli Air Force was. In my opinion, one of those 6 torpedoes never got to leave the torpedo tubes because of the Israeli Navy incompetence.
All right, let me read this quote from Steve Forslund. Steve Forslund is an intelligence analyst for the 544th Air Reconnaissance Technical Wing, then the highest level strategic planning office in the Air Force. And I'm quoting Cruzen's piece. Quote from Forslund: "The ground control station," meaning the Israeli ground control station, "stated that the target was an American, and for the aircraft to confirm it," Forslund recalled. "The aircraft did confirm the identity of the target as American by the American flag." Quote, "The ground control station ordered the aircraft to attack and sink the target and ensure they left no survivors." Forslund said he clearly recalled, quote, "the obvious frustration of the controller over the inability of the pilots to sink the target quickly and completely. He kept insisting the mission had to sink the target and was frustrated with the pilot's responses that it didn't sink. Nor, Forslund said, was he the only member of his unit to have read the transcripts. Everybody saw these, Forslund, now retired after 26 years in the military." So if this is correct, the mission is to sink the boat. What did you witness there? Just take us through the events as you saw them.
I was actually below decks when the attack took place. We had a drill GQ at noon local time and had secured from that drill GQ about 1,300 hours at 1 o'clock. I went to small stores aboard the ship. When I was ordered to her, I didn't have very many uniforms with me, and I needed some more pieces of clothing. So I went to small stores and purchased some articles of underclothing and T-shirts. And I was at my bunk stamping my name on those T-shirts to make sure they got separated out correctly in the laundry when the first shell struck the ship. I had never been under combat conditions before, but I knew immediately that we were under attack just from the sound of the shells striking the ship. So I immediately dropped what I was doing and went to my GQ station, which was in the research spaces in the bowels of the ship below the waterline. I remember a Chief Melvin Smith stating, "Well, I guess we better start emergency destruction." That's one of the things that intelligence personnel just do not want to hear. There was so much work that went into processing the intelligence, which we had, manuals for decoding materials and language materials, reels and reels and reels of magnetic tape of combat conversations that we had recorded. We didn't want to hear that. But we got out our ditching bags and filled them. I was sitting at a plotting table in the processing and reporting area when the division officer, Lieutenant Maury Bennett, stuck his head in the door, and he said, "Sergeant Lockwood, would you come here a moment, please?" I stepped out into the passageway, which ran down the center of the ship, and Mr. Bennett, Lieutenant Bennett, and Lieutenant Commander Dave Armstrong began a conversation with me about these ditching bags. They needed to be put up topside and pitched over the side. The whole idea was to get them in the water where no other country could retrieve the intelligence information that we had. Well, there's a bunch of shooting going on topside, and that's a Marine's job. So apparently I was called to get a working party together to get rid of those ditching bags.
Let me ask you one question. Who did you think was attacking you at that time?
The assumption was that they were Arabs, United Arab Republic, or Egyptians. We had no idea that it was the Israelis. Just about the time that conversation about the ditching bags ensued, there was a blinding flash. A torpedo had struck. I didn't realize that it was a torpedo at the time, but I was knocked to the deck. The first thought that crossed my mind was life was over with. I thought, well, Lord, I guess this is it. I guess I'm coming home. At least Lois and the kids are taken care of. Lois is my wife. I felt something cold, and I kind of stupidly looked down, and water was coming in around my feet, and it felt cold. And I thought, oh my God, we're in trouble. And I struggled to my feet, and I heard a sailor behind me moaning, and the water is starting to come up pretty quickly. I turned around and tried to pull the sailor loose. He had been pinned under a steel bulkhead, a temporary bulkhead, which separated the spaces so that people that didn't belong in there couldn't get in there. When that torpedo struck, the explosion of it just blew that bulkhead out like a gigantic mushroom. And the man, I didn't find out until, 25 years later who it was. His name was Joe Lentini. He had been struck by a piece of shrapnel from the aircraft rockets in his left thigh, and was sitting on the deck leaning up against the ladderway that went to the next level above and trying to put a tourniquet on his wound when the torpedo struck. His left leg was propped up, and when that bulkhead struck his leg, it just made toothpicks of his leg and pinned him into that wreckage. I tried to get
when did you realize the attack was Israeli?
Not until the next day. I tried to get my hands under his armpits and pull him loose, but he was wedged in there really tightly, and I'm trying to holler at him. I said, come on, you got to help me. You can't do it by myself. And I'm tugging and pulling on him, and the water was up to his chin by then. I said, come on, get your legs under you and push. I can't do it by myself. Come on, push, push. And he got his right leg under him. I didn't know his left leg was smashed. He got his right leg under him and pushed just hard enough to where I could free him, but his leg was still tangled up in that wreckage. And by that time, the water was in, 1.5 feet of the overhead. There were some pipes up there. And I saw another unconscious sailor starting to float out the torpedo hole. I reached down and got an arm around him and held his head above water, and I said to Joe Lentini, said, here, get a hold of these pipes up here and hold yourself up. And a lot of the sailors were all crowding around the ladderway to the next level above, and there was a lot of shouting and confusion going on. And as loudly as I could, I hollered, knock it off. If y'all don't settle down, none of us will get out of here alive. And I heard Mr. Bennett was at the top of the ladderway to the next ladder above. I heard him say, this is Mr. Bennett, open this hatch. And apparently I fell into unconsciousness about that time, because the next thing I remember, I was down there alone with an unconscious sailor, and life wasn't very pretty. The hatch was sealed shut. I tried to pull this unconscious sailor, didn't even know who it was, didn't find out who that was until some 30 years later. Tried to get him up the ladderway, dropped him. The ship was rolling and water was gushing in and out of the torpedo hole. Went back and got him, tried to get him up the ladderway, slipped and dropped him again. The railing to the ladderway had been bent by a piece of shrapnel from the torpedo, so it was a very narrow opening. I got him above that, the hatch was closed. I started pounding on the hatch, And the captain had sent one of the damage control people, his name was Phil Turney, sent him down there to take a look and see how badly the ship was damaged, whether or not we were going to sink right away. And Phil heard me pounding on the hatch and opened the hatch and let me out along with this unconscious sailor.
And during all this time, the attack is continuing.
Yes, the aircraft were still fighting us. The torpedo boats were circling us and riddling us with heavy machine gun fire. The Israelis were using a 30-millimeter shell, which is considerably larger than our 50-millimeter shell that is our standard machine gun for torpedo boats. It's about 2.5 times the size.
And my understanding, there's a raft leaves, an escape raft, and they start to strafe this raft. Is that correct?
Yeah, all of our life rafts, we had 2 racks with inflatable life rafts on them. Those were napalm. There was nothing left of those but a few rags from the davits. Those were totally unusable. The Captain's launch and the Liberty launch, with the 2 boats that we had that were used for getting personnel back and forth between shore and the ship, were just riddled with heavy caliber fire. They were totally useless.
So in your mind, is there any doubt that the mission was no survivors?
No survivors, absolutely no survivors.
Okay, Ray, there's some evidence now. We know that there was actually an earlier SOS that did make it through, even though there was jamming, and there were some planes scrambled, and then what happened? So what do we know about that part of the story?
Well, we know that Terry Halbardier succeeded in joining that cable and getting the SOS out, which in turn was intercepted by the Israelis, who broke off the attack. Now, meanwhile, the commander of the 6th Task Force there in the Mediterranean had sent fighter bombers from the USS Saratoga and the USS America to do battle with whoever it was that was attacking his naval ship, the USS Liberty. We know furthermore that they were called back on the direct instruction of Secretary of Defense McNamara and the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson. We know that from several sources. One of them is from Admiral Geiss, who was in receipt of these orders and very reluctantly ordered his fighter bombers back. He told one of the Liberty crew who managed to make it to the USS America that he was ordered not to pursue this, to turn them back, because President Johnson did not want to embarrass an ally, Israel. So that's one of the indications here. The others are either in communications intelligence. You know, the big thing here, Paul, for a intelligence officer is that there are certain species of intelligence after which analysts or journalists actually lust, okay? And those are hard evidence, like intercepted communications. And when we have the Israeli pilots, as we do, saying, that's an American ship, and we have ground control saying, follow your orders, strike it, well, what further need have we for proof? So number one, what we know is that it was a deliberate attack that was meant to sink everything with no survivors. And number two, we know that it was covered up because everything done in the aftermath of that attack was done to cover it up, to include naval officers, naval lawyers who were persuaded to keep their mouths shut under orders because we did not want to embarrass an ally.
Now, when Johnson, if this report is correct, and Johnson calls back the planes, it must be clear that the mission at that time is to sink the boat. If you're calling back the planes, you're allowing the attack to continue. The attack continues, leads to no survivors.
Joe Tully was skipper of the USS Saratoga. He came to our 25th reunion in Rapid City, South Dakota. And Captain Tully told me personally that the aircraft which he had initially launched had some nuclear weapons aboard them. he had assumed that the reason that they were recalled was because of those nuclear weapons. So he ordered all the nuclear weapons retrieved and rearmed with conventional warfare and relaunched. Admiral Geis notified Washington, and Robert McNamara came back on the line, ordering them returned. Admiral Geis said he wanted to hear that from higher authority. Lyndon Johnson himself came on and said, "Get those aircraft back. I will not have my allies embarrassed." Now, excuse me. The Israelis were using unmarked aircraft. We did not know who was attacking us. Excuse me, unmarked aircraft is a violation of international law. So since the Israelis were using unmarked aircraft and we did not know who was attacking us, how did Lyndon Johnson know that his allies were attacking us?
How did you know they're unmarked? You could see yourself? There's no markings on these planes?
I did not see them myself, but the other crew members did.
If you try to analyze the Israeli position, whether it starts in error or not, and from what you're saying, it seems not very plausible that it's an error, then the plan from the very beginning has to be to sink the ship, no survivors. Otherwise, the evidence, there's too many people to say what happened. Then what you're suggesting is that at the very least, at some fairly early on into this attack, President Johnson decides not to prevent it, not to stop it. We have one quote about not embarrassing that we don't know any more of the conversation. Ray and I talked about this interview prior to this, and we just said we're going to be very careful about trying to say what do we have evidence and what does one speculate or theorize about. So we're going to stop this in part one. We're going to do a part two. But Ray, sum up, just to end this, sum up what we know, what's evidence. In part two, we'll talk a little bit more about why we think this might have happened and go a little further into it all. But just sum up, from your point of view as someone who analyzed data for a long time, what's the evidence here, quickly?
Well, it's very bizarre, Paul, because it admits of no other interpretation than a deliberate Israeli attack on a U.S. naval ship with the intent of sinking the ship and killing all crew. That's really hard to believe, but the evidence is unassailable. We know that. That's fact. That's not opinion. We also know from confessions by Navy lawyers and by all manner of other circumstances that this thing was covered up and still is covered up by the official version. So that we know, cover up and attack, deliberate attack. What we don't know, and it boggles the mind, why did the Israelis do it? And I don't know of any diplomat or U.S. official that has taken the trouble to ask them.
All right, in part two, we're going to continue this conversation. Again, we're going to try to be careful about where there's evidence and where there's, I guess, speculation. But please join us for the continuation of this conversation about the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty on the Real News Network.